Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. The 1990s proved to be quite the revolutionary time for British television. A new millennium was approaching, and indeed, a boatload of new technological advances were due to come swiftly along with it. Perhaps the biggest was the advent of digital television, the next big step forward for the medium, one that would ultimately consign the cosy old days of analogue to the history books. For the BBC, as the UK's leading broadcaster, they knew they would have to adapt in order to try and maintain the spot that they had. But as well as adapting during the 1990s, one thing they also did in earnest was expand. We'll be looking at 3 ventures that were a result of this expansion. These may be names you faintly remember, or maybe haven't even heard of at all. But whilst they may not exist in today's BBC portfolio, each of them help lay some kind of groundwork for the kinds of services the BBC offers to audiences today.
The proposal is in the new broadcasting bill published today, which contains plans for sweeping changes to television and radio. The government says that the plans will mean more choice for the viewer. Critics say quality will suffer.
At the start of the 1990s, the Broadcasting Act of that year was a sweeping statement as to how British television was going to change and evolve throughout the decade and beyond. Not only did industry big boys like ITV and the BBC have to contend with this, but the emerging market of satellite television, which was gaining ground year on year, was another potential threat. Dipping their toes into expanding on a global scale, 1991 would see the launch of BBC World Service Television.
Martyn, BBC News, Tokyo.
11 hours Greenwich Mean Time. BBC World Service. News.
Probably tanks in that direction also.
All over the world, there are people for whom the BBC's World Service radio broadcasts are a crucial source of information. A beacon of impartiality in a world where sometimes the truth can be hard to find. Today marks the climax of a project which is one of the most exciting in world broadcasting. It's called World Service Television.
This venture was the first time the BBC experimented with broadcasting on a worldwide scale via the medium of television, and was available in several territories within the continents of Europe, Africa and Asia. However, quite unlike the BBC, World Service Television would feature the presence of the dreaded C word uttered around the corridors of Television Centre: commercials. Yes, a BBC branded channel funded by commercial advertising. Subscriptions also played a part as well, as World Service Television was often included within various cable or satellite packages depending on the territory. The channel would contain a mix of programmes originally shown in the UK via BBC One and BBC Two. It even had children's BBC shows airing as well. On the whole, World Service Television was in operation successfully for its first few years, but during the early days of 1995, a sweeping change would come into effect that would split World Service Television in two, and represent the next step of the BBC's overall expansion in worldwide broadcasting. During the January of 1995, World Service Television ceased to exist. In its wake, 2 new channels were born. The first was simply titled BBC World.
This is BBC World, the BBC's international news channel. Now, the world today, with Donald McCormick and Nicky Marks.
It was a 24-hour international news channel in a similar vein to the American alternative, CNN. These types of channels may be a dime a dozen today, but for 1995 to have a service like this accessible at any time of day across several continents would have been seen as quite a big move for the Beeb. The second new channel was the enticingly titled BBC Prime. With a very sophisticated presentation, BBC Prime promised the highest quality entertainment for its viewers. Prime was also a 24-hour service, focusing on entertainment of all kinds. The key difference was that whilst BBC World was a free-to-air channel, so if you were a keen BBC viewer in, say, Europe or Asia, you'd have to cough up some cash. Whilst World Service Television had gone to great efforts to showcase BBC programmes of all kinds to the rest of the world, I think the two-channel split was the right way to go at the time. With more and more new television channels reaching the airwaves year after year, why not zone in on a particular genre for them to broadcast? BBC Prime showcased much of the BBC's best entertainment offerings to the rest of the world, drawing upon the rich archive the broadcaster had built up over the last several decades. The majority of programming was BBC in origin, but a chunk of programmes were also provided from Thames Television. Thames had ceased to be a relevant name in TV earlier in the decade when they lost the lucrative London licence to newcomer Carlton, so the presence of Thames programming on a BBC branded channel that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. In 1997, the corporation underwent the biggest rebrand in its history at that time, and with the new look appearing on UK-based operations, it would only be a matter of time before the change would also hit the international ones too. With brand new idents to boot, BBC Prime continued to trundle along humbly throughout much of the 2000s. But it seems these things are never meant to last forever, and in 2006, the BBC announced that Prime would eventually be phased out as a brand to be replaced and rechristened as the much more generic sounding BBC Entertainment, which would be planned and fittingly ran by BBC Worldwide, the commercial subsidiary of the corporation itself. Operating in much the same way that Prime did, entertainment would gradually be dropped out from several countries during the 2010s before the last feed ceased operation quite recently on the 31st of March 2024. BBC Prime was born from an earlier concept seen within World Service Television, a desire to showcase the BBC's high-quality programming to audiences across the entire world. These next two expansions to the BBC's portfolio, however, are much closer to home. Let's go back to the magical year that was 1999.
See that?
What?
That is the future.
What? A load of noughts and ones?
Exactly. That's digital. The future of broadcasting.
So what's so wonderful about that then?
Well, up until now, all we've had are these.
Wavy things?
Analog waves, to be precise.
Ah, why the three cliffs?
That's caused by interference you sometimes get when the wavy things,
Analog waves.
thank you, bounce off, say, the nearest tall building or anything.
Ah.
Whereas with digital, interference doesn't affect the picture at all.
Ah, so how do we become digital then?
Well, soon anyone can become digital if they want to, even you.
Ah, now there's a perfect image.
And because digital channels don't take up as much room, you'll be able to receive many more channels.
Well, you can't have too much quality TV, can you?
Well, if you'd like more information, call the BBC on 0990 11 8833.
Thank you.
Digital television was a concept that was starting to become more familiar to audiences across Britain. Whilst at the time it was still quite costly to fully embrace digital as an average consumer, all of the major broadcasters wanted in on this new dimension of television. The BBC had been itching to expand into the space, and initially hoped that new BBC-branded channels could be achieved with the help of a long-time ally, Flextech. Thanks to their previous collaboration, the UK TV network had been born, which ran a variety of channels that were very BBC-esque, but didn't carry the branding and also ran commercials. When the prospect of more new channels came about, the BBC and Flextech ran into some disagreements. Unlike the UK TV network, the BBC wanted these new channels to bear their name in the branding. Flextech seemingly had no issue with this, but pushed for the new channels to feature adverts. Given that these were going to be British-based channels, the BBC outright rejected the idea of adverts on a domestic channel that bore the corporation's name. After relentless back and forth, a decision was ultimately reached. a handful of new channels would become part of the UK TV network, and indeed carry adverts as Flextech had wanted. But 2 new channels would be free of them, and indeed be branded as BBC Operations. One of these 2 was BBC Knowledge.
Welcome to the newest digital channel on the BBC, and remember, knowledge is power.
Originally designated as BBC Learning, Knowledge made its intentions and remit clear soon after its launch on the 1st of June 1999. For 6 hours a day, this channel focused on showcasing educational or more informational based programming. These were areas the BBC had steeped itself in and prided itself on for decades at this point, so having a channel dedicated to such genres seemed like an ideal move on paper. Even though education was the beating heart of Knowledge, the service aimed to make the content fun and easily accessible to those watching of all ages.
Now exclusive to BBC Knowledge are weekly updates on the lives and loves of the people of Saint-Tropez.
Whilst this ambition may have been a good one, in reality it didn't quite connect with audiences. Consistently low ratings were recorded for Knowledge, and just a few years after its launch, it underwent a major rebrand. Alongside new idents, the Let's Make Learning Fun angle was dropped, in favour of a much more serious and grounded tone, with documentaries of various topics making up the bulk of the now 24-hour schedule. However, even when Knowledge underwent its rebranding in 2001, there were bigger plans afoot at the BBC. Wanting to expand even further into digital television, the corporation had submitted plans to the government outlining their strategy. This included the removal of Knowledge entirely, to be replaced by something called BBC4. And so, whilst the output had changed entirely, it wasn't some attempt to keep BBC Knowledge alive and for it to grow, but it merely became a testing ground for what would eventually become BBC4, which would launch in the spring of 2002, ending Knowledge's very short-lived and troubled life on the airwaves.
That's it for us tonight. As you've heard, an exciting beginning for a brand new channel is only hours away. BBC4 starts this evening at 7 o'clock. We look forward to what's to come, but from all of us here at BBC Knowledge, it's good night and goodbye.
This is BBC4. Good evening and welcome to the launch of Britain's newest channel, devoted to culture, music, documentaries, performance and world cinema. Your place to think.
Its successor still continues to broadcast to this day, more than 20 years later, though in the face of ever-increasing budget cuts and the shift to a more online-based way of consuming content, it's constantly being touted that BBC4 may eventually shut down as a TV channel, moving its entire operations to become online-based only. Just goes to show that even if you outlive and surpass your predecessor in terms of success, it doesn't mean you'll be around forever.
A hidden Victorian history in an hour, a brutal tale of empire and resistance in the Punjab, the stolen Maharaja, Britain's Indian royal here on BBC4. First, further back to the Stuarts. Lucy Worsley sorts fact from fiction as she investigates the reign of Queen Anne.
The final major venture I wanted to talk about in regard to the corporation's rapid expansion of the 1990s is a channel formerly known as BBC Choice.
So, in their wisdom, the BBC have decided not to give me a new series. They're giving me a whole new channel, BBC Quirk. TV out of left field. Oh, when we've got full live coverage of Glastonbury. TV out of a muddy field with limited toilet facilities. A TV channel that picks up the baton from BBC 1 and 2 and runs amok with it.
There will be themes.
You might get a whole night of stuff on your favourite programme, or a Vets in Practice Extra where we do things in a bit more detail. And on Saturday nights there'll be a chance to catch up on the week's most talked about BBC programmes. Apparently it's all fine, but they don't like the name Quirk. They want to call this new channel BBC Choice. Same sort of in-depth, in-touch, please adjust your expectations sort of thing, just not such a good name. BBC Choice. I still think Quirk's better.
Launching on the 23rd of September 1998, it had the distinctive honour of being the first ever television channel in Britain to be broadcast exclusively in digital as opposed to analogue. This was a big step for the BBC, one that highlighted their desire to get themselves into the digital world and take their millions of audience members along with them. There was just one small problem around the time of BBC Choice's launch. No one had a digital receiver. Quite literally. The main providers of digital for the UK, which would be Sky Digital and the very ill-fated On Digital, were still a few months away. So, if the public couldn't purchase the kit necessary in order to receive BBC Choice, why on earth did the Beeb go ahead and launch it anyway? Well, rather than wait for Sky or On Digital to get their services in operation, the BBC decided to utilise another fast-growing piece of technology: the internet. The launch of BBC Choice was broadcast online.
Hello and welcome to BBC Choice, and this is where it all starts, the brand new digital channel from the BBC.
On opening day, it was a mixture of programmes, including repeats of notable first episodes from shows as far apart as Monty Python and EastEnders, as well as a special instalment of long-running programme Tomorrow's World, which served as a guide to digital television. Once digital providers were up and running, BBC Choice could operate as originally intended, as a wholly digital television channel. Choice offered quite the all sorts in terms of programming, from shows originally from BBC's 1 and 2, some original programming often revolving around behind-the-scenes content, as well as extensive and often then exclusive coverage of big music festivals like Glastonbury. Sports fans could also benefit from BBC Choice, as it could offer extended coverage of big events, often at times when BBC's 1 or 2 would have to stop their coverage early. Children were also catered for, as a wide selection of CBBC shows, both old and new, were broadcast throughout the daytime on Choice. Audiences could even get in touch with certain programmes via phone or even the newfangled email. BBC Choice would offer extensions to programmes like Watchdog and Crime Watch, allowing viewers to utilise this newfound interactivity, though again, these shows were only on Choice and viewers would have to have the necessary digital equipment in order to receive it. But despite the new digital format, BBC Choice was seemingly trundling along, but like many of its peers, as the 21st century kicked in, major changes were afoot for the channel.
I can watch anything, from behind the scenes at BBC Drama to Glastonbury, on the BBC's new channel, BBC Choice.
In its first few years, BBC Choice, in a way, was kind of like a UK-only version of BBC Prime. To everywhere except Britain, Prime offered viewers a wide mix of entertainment programming, just as BBC Choice did to UK audiences. Choice was arguably a bit more expansive than its older sibling, but nonetheless it was decided that the channel needed to have a much more focused demographic of the audience to appeal to. The group chosen was the ever-tricky young adults. This age range had been notoriously difficult for the BBC to continuously connect with, given the corporation's long-standing reputation of being old-fashioned, stuffy, and rather highbrow. The result of this shift was that BBC Choice's offerings were overhauled, with several 15-minute programmes being put into place.
You know you want it. What's the name of this show?
For the biggest stars.
Oh, Liquid News, I know that.
Bafflingly, just months after this complete pivot, it was announced that BBC Choice, exactly in the same way as BBC Knowledge, would be phased out and make way for the more numerically named BBC Three. The successor's remit would remain the same as Choice's, to appeal specifically to the young adult demographic of the television audience. This was just one of many proposed digital plans that the BBC submitted to the government for approval. BBC 4, as we know, was approved. The launch of 2 new children's channels, CBBC and CBeebies, was also approved. However, one proposal was rejected, and that was BBC 3. Many reasons were presented, one of the biggest being that the proposed format for the new face of Choice would be far too similar to its commercial rivals, specifically ITV2 and the recently launched E4, both of whom were also targeting the young adult demographic. In a bid to get around this, the BBC made alterations to the planned BBC 3, including the presence of a short news programme, as well as claiming the target audience was now aimed between 25 and 34-year-olds. This delay gave BBC Choice a small extension on its televisual life. It awkwardly meant that BBC 4 would launch before BBC 3, which is rather humorous and very BBC if you think about it. With launch day now pushed back by almost a year, the corporation decided to essentially launch BBC 3 while still under the BBC Choice name. What I mean by this is that the programming on Choice became increasingly catered to the demographic they wanted with 3, with the short news bulletins included too. Once the new BBC 3 proposal was approved by government in the autumn of 2002, even BBC Choice's idents reflected the incoming rebrand. Construction workers wandering around, changing the entire structure of BBC Choice for something new and shiny to take its place very shortly. Ultimately, in the February of 2003, BBC Choice would broadcast for the final time, and viewers would next tune in to see the presence of a brand new name.
Good evening, welcome to BBC Choice, but it's not for long because BBC 3's here tomorrow.
And also some very gobby slugs.
It's a magic number. Yes, it is. That's a magic number.
Good evening and welcome to BBC 3.
BBC 3 had finally arrived, and across the next 2 decades, it would truly deliver on its remit to provide programming that is accessible, relevant, and engaging to the young adult demographic. It had its ups and downs, notably a move to online only in 2016, before storming back to traditional television in 2022, where it remains today. Like BBC 4, however, there's always rumours about that 3 may end up going back to an online-only home. As to whether it will,
time will tell. Always does.
It's all jolly exciting, isn't it?
BBC Digital. The adventure starts here. Call us for more information.
When looking back at the BBC's expansion during the 1990s, you can hardly fault their ambition. Sensing that the television landscape was about to change in one of the most radical ways since its initial inception, launching all these new services even in a vain attempt to see what worked and what didn't is a valiant effort to say the least. Broadcasting the BBC around the world is something the corporation still very much pursues today, with various television channels dedicated to such an endeavour still in existence, but none of them would have been around had it not been for that initial launch of World Service Television back in 1991. And even though successes have come and gone, the BBC's worldwide presence is still maintained. As for its solely digital efforts, BBC Knowledge and BBC Choice haven't been around for nearly a quarter of a century. Unless you remember them from the time or have an interest in this sort of stuff, then this may well be the very first time that you're hearing about them. And whilst they had good concepts on paper, it feels like they were hardly given adequate time to find their feet, before the BBC was planning major shake-ups and rebrands to what we eventually got in BBC's 3 and 4. But again, whilst we enjoy tons of content from those channels now, and probably take them for granted to some degree, they wouldn't exist in the way they do now, had it not been for those tentative first steps taken in the late 1990s. So, was the BBC's expansion during that decade a successful one? In terms of what they launched, some would say no, but in terms of how it's helped the corporation evolve its operations into what they are today, I think you could say the ventures were pretty successful indeed. Except for poor old BBC Select. That's a whole story of failure in itself. Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Sean Knock, Dord Khan, Ethan Carberry-Holt, Liam Domain, AJ Mac 200017, Deck, Jen, Traffy, Evan Hart 41 Radio, Tim Ripley, Mr. Eurovision 1986, Monano Thurman, John Wakefield, 40-something Manchild, Jerry Ralph, John McLeod, James Wallace, Ben, Kat Hegarty, Stephen Oliver, Tegan, Shadow Fiend 180X, Swan Ronson, Adam Gamer, Fonzie Daz, Real Random, and Seraphic Euphoria, our AMTV staff members.